Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to the Black Banners podcast. This is episode 8, and today we are exploring the story of Abdelhamid al-Thani, one of the most courageous and progressive leaders in contemporary Muslim history. Born on the 17th of Sha'ban 1258 after Hijrah, or on Wednesday, September 22nd, 1842 in the Sirgan Palace in Istanbul, the young man loved to ride horses and play sports. He was described by his father as a quiet skeptic, with his knowledge of the deen showing him a clear contradiction in the westernized path the Ottoman was heading. He was distinguished for his strong intellect and sharp memory, as well as his amazing carpentry skills. He was also a huge fan of history in general, educated by his Ottoman scholars who got him intrigued and in love with deeply studying the history of the Muslims. I wonder what kinds of benefits this had in his understanding of the caliphate during his reign. His mother died when he was 10 years old, and he was sent to be taken care of by his stepmother. Abdulhamid was trained and raised in many aspects of leadership in the royal palace as a young man, learning Arabic, Persian, French, German, and studying religious and political sciences, including hadith sciences. He studied Sharia and hadith under Sheikh Omar Hudusi Effendi. He was also trained in the use of weaponry, becoming quite accurate with his shot. His father died when he was 18, and Abdulhamid's uncle took over as the Ottoman Sultan and continued its westernized course of action. Abdulhamid then became the second crown prince of the Ottoman Empire under his uncle. In 1863, when he was 21 years old, he traveled to Egypt with his uncle Abdulaziz, where he got the experience of traveling by train around Egypt. But sadly, tragedy would strike, and in 1876, the 32nd Ottoman Sultan, Abdulaziz Khan, his uncle, was martyred and deposed by a coup. Midhat Pasha, along with several other members of the Young Turks and 60 defective soldiers from the Ottoman military, carried out a siege of the palace, forcing out the Sultan and looting him along with many of his belongings. He was then taken into custody, where he was killed and made to look like he committed suicide. However, it seems that the death of Abdulaziz heavily affected Murad V, who had taken over after him, which caused him to begin to have occasionally uncontrollable tremors that became very prevalent. When his erratic twitches and tremors escalated and he started losing control of his behavior, he was officially deemed unfit for the throne and taken to be treated by doctors. After the results came back inconclusive, Abdelhamid, the other crown prince, was then designated Sultan and took the reins from his uncle. And on September 7th, 1876, Abdelhamid al-Thani came to power at the age of 34, officially becoming the 27th caliph on the heels of an oncoming war with Russia. As described in his memoir, a sword was placed around the Sultan, and he visited several Islamic historical sites, followed by crowds of people. Hundreds of thousands crowded along the roads and watched as the Sultan's entourage moved to the Topkapi Palace. The navy was firing volleys around the harbor in celebration of his enthronement. Abdelhamid sat in the golden throne, and one by one Ottoman notables and dignitaries pledged their allegiance to him. He accepted the Grand Vizier and officially became the 33rd Ottoman Sultan. According to the memoir, the Ottoman administration offered to keep Murad V as Sultan and allow Abdelhamid al-Thani to run things behind the scenes, but Abdelhamid refused. He wanted the empire to be represented by a singular sultan. His education and training in leadership within the Ottoman from a young age allowed him to quickly adapt to power. He saw what happened to his uncle Abdulaziz, and he knew he had to walk with a knife to his back until he could secure himself and keep an eye on the men around him. And so for this reason, he moved his administrative operations headquarters to a different location in the Yildiz Palace, hiring 4 different architects with different pieces of the blueprint. So they all built a different part of the building without knowing the blueprint for the rest of the building, to ensure that he was the only man to know the design of the building in its entirety. His goal was to unite the Muslim Ummah under the banner of Islam, and so he started building relations with Muslims in India and South Asia. He was given the draft of the supposed constitution that he was to approve by Midhat Pasha. This constitution was pushing the Ottoman Empire away from Islam and closer to Western secularism. He composed a group of ulama, ministers, and jurists to review the draft and make sure it followed Sharia and traditional Islamic law and customs. He understood that he did not yet have dominance or control over his entire administration, so he couldn't make rash decisions or toss the constitution immediately like he wanted to. This was a liberal secular constitution created by the Young Turks and a few various Ottoman statesmen, who thought that a Western European approach to politics would be the most effective in saving their Islamic caliphate. You see the contradiction here. They were trying to move away from Sharia and closer to a liberal secular society. Abdelhamid went in and changed some of the articles of the constitution first, one that would put the Ottoman basically at the mercy of the Europeans. The new Ottoman constitution came into effect around 2 months after his rise to power on December 23, 1876, in the midst of the Balkan uprising. Midhat Pasha was hoping this constitution would curb Russia's advance into the empire and impress the other European delegates, who weren't impressed and simply didn't care about it. The constitution had no effect on the empire's relations with Russia or the West, and Midhat Pasha's proposals were rejected at a conference in Istanbul and he was dismissed by the Sultan. He began stirring up trouble within the military and began trying to form his own army he called the nation's soldiers. He was invited to the Sultan's palace on February 5th, 1877, where he was told about his exile and he was sent to Italy on a train. On March 19th, 1877, Abdulhamid held another assembly to reopen the issue of state constitution and expressed what he felt would be the best course of action for the state. He wanted the state to unite under Ottomanism, allowing people of different religions and backgrounds to be represented by the administration. The first assembly was headed up by Midhat Wafik Pasha and had 120 deputies, only 71 of whom were Muslim and a majority of whom were Arab, Bosnian, Kurdish, or Circassian. Unfortunately, many of these dignitaries didn't understand the purpose of their representation. Some even asked for their language to be the official language of the empire or independence for their state. Europe was pressuring the Ottomans into including European envoys within their administration, which the Sultan strongly opposed and rejected. He knew that the state the Ottomans were in were directly because of European interference, so inviting the Europeans in to carve up the empire even more would have been a foolish move. One of Abdulhamid's first courses of action was cutting the expenses of the palace. He then dissolved the Council of Envoys, which was Europe's control in the Ottoman Empire, in which the European powers of the time called him a tyrant for it. Late 19th century, Britain and Russia were calling Abdulhamid a tyrant for not letting them openly meddle in the Caliphate's affairs. What a world we live in. They continued to spread chaos and disorder within the Caliphate in secret, through groups such as the Freemasons and the Young Turks movement and the Ottoman Unity Committee, which was against Abdulhamid's pan-Islamic rule. These groups believed in a European-style rule of the nation, with European values such as nationalism and intense focus on industrialization. But the Sultan knew about these secret groups, and he sent his own secret service members to find and arrest these traitors. Russia used this as justification for invasion of the Ottoman lands, and in 1877 the Ottomans went to war with the Russian Tsar, as the Russians pushed south for land, encouraging the Slavs of the Ottoman Empire to revolt. All of Europe was anticipating the Sultan's war with Russia, to see what territory they could cut and take when it gets bad for the Muslims. The Caliphate was pushed back to Istanbul, where they held and cut the Europeans from entering Anatolia. By 1878, the Ottomans had lost much of their Balkan territory to Russia and Austria after the Russo-Turkish War, signing the Treaty of San Stefano to try and cut their losses. The Russians kicked thousands of Circassian Muslims from their homes, forcing them south. After the war with Russia, Abdelhamid officially suspended the Young Turks' westernized constitution in February of 1878 and threw it in the garbage. He constructed the Baghdad and Hejaz railways, cutting down the pilgrimage journey time from 40 days to 4, and took 7 days to finish. Muslims worldwide donated to build this railway, including Abdulhamid, who donated 320,000 of his own pounds towards its construction. He really cared about this railway. For him, this was step one in reunifying the Muslim world, by physically connecting the people together. Even the Shah of Iran donated 50,000 towards this cause. This train would function for 9 years before the Arab Revolt, which I'm not going to talk about in this video for your sake. Abdulhamid also extended the Anatolian and Rumlite railways. He began the registration of Ottoman citizens. He opened a faculty of law, faculty of the arts, faculty of civil engineering, faculty of veterinary medicine, faculty of customs, faculty of agriculture, school of crafts and handwork, and many other smaller schools. He opened an Islamic institution for preaching the deen and sent the graduates from this university all around the Muslim world to preach Islamic unity and to reinvigorate the Islamic spirit within the Muslims to fight together. The West, of course, countered this very heavily. They did not want Muslim unity in any capacity. Abdulhamid wanted to reform the Ottoman judicial system to ensure it continues to follow the guidelines of Islamic court laws. He reformed the land laws in the Ottoman and tried to reverse the feudal rule of much of the Islamic lands as much as he possibly can, and was actually quite effective as part of his bigger plan of destroying corruption in the Ottoman state and reinstating the Islamic integrity of the Caliphate. He wanted to bring the Caliphate back together where it was tearing at the seams, and he knew step one was equality among men. He said, "May Allah have mercy on him. Our ties to the rest of the Muslims everywhere must be strengthened. We must get closer and closer to each other. There is no hope for the future except with this unity." Primary and secondary military schools were systematically opened around the Ottoman state, He built around 30,000 kilometers of telephone and electricity lines, and hired German engineers to set up their telecommunication lines. Telegraph messages were being used and operated by German companies, and Ottoman troops actually undertook military exercises and training in Germany. Europe was heavily investing in secular groups within the Ottoman, and they wanted to push the Ottoman to war to allow for full chaos to ensue. They planned to destroy the Ottoman from the inside. In 1889, a new group formed in Paris called the CUP, Committee of Unity and Progress, a liberal group that secretly planned the dethronement of Abdelhamid and the rule of Turkey with a renewed French-style secular rule. This group was a product of the Young Turks, and they would use it to try and open up the caliphate from the inside. One of the leaders was known as Ismail Enver Pasha, who was a well-known Freemason and also a member of the Young Turks movement. Other founders of the group are interesting, many of them being Kurdish, Albanian, and other nationalities. In 1890, the British and the Russians gave Armenian groups weapons, which they used to savagely attack and massacre Kurdish villages. They demanded autonomy and control and resorted to violence to get the Ottomans' attention. Abdelhamid gave the Kurds a semi-autonomous region and armed them to defend themselves against the Armenians. They came to be called the Hamidian Regiment. The Armenians responded by forming the Armenian Revolutionary Federation in 1890. Clashes ensued and the Armenians continued their senseless violence against Kurds, such as the Sassoon massacre of 1894. The Kurds struck back, killing enough Armenians to get the attention of Western nations. Britain, France, and Russia heavily covered the deaths of these hostile Armenians, leaving out the deaths of their Kurdish counterparts. To this day, the information on these events is very different between sources, with some not even mentioning the Armenian attacks and the number of Armenian deaths flying between 40,000 and 300,000. In 1897, a new threat to the Caliphate emerged. The Zionists made their intentions for taking Palestine clear in a conference in Switzerland, with the leader himself, Theodore Herzl, pleading with the Sultan and begging him for access to Palestinian land. Herzl even offered to pay off most of the Ottomans' crippling debt. Abdelhamid refused and then imposed more restrictions on Zionist access to the land, cutting it down to only 30-day visits. This same year, in 1897, Crete started to cause problems for the Ottoman and requested to be part of Greece. The Greeks sent a force to the island that were defeated by the Ottomans in the Greco-Turkish War of 1897. However, the island came under British, Russian, and French control because of the Treaty of Constantinople. Abdelhamid worked to modernize the Ottomans as much as he could without the secular constitution of the CUP. He believed that the country could move forward industrially without tainting their Islamic integrity. By the start of the 20th century, Abdelhamid was facing gang wars in Macedonia and battling Greece, as well as facing the Western nations' pressure through classic division and subjugation. In 1905, the Armenians attempted to assassinate Abdelhamid on his way out of the mosque with a bomb and completely failed. And around this time, the Caliphate was undergoing more and more pressure, making things very tough for Abdelhamid and his family. In 1908, the Freemasons and the secularists finally moved forward with their plan to dethrone the Sultan. The Young Turks revolution that was carefully premeditated was finally executed, when a contingent of defects from the Ottoman army started marching on Istanbul from Salonika, in which Abdelhamid chose to step down instead of crushing the rebellion. They forced him to bring back the suspended constitution of 1876 and restore the parliament, which was the Young Turks' connection to the European liberal politics. Finally, in early spring of 1909, a delegation of 4 men came to deliver the order of dethronement to Abdelhamid, the most significant of them being Emmanuel Carasso, who became the leader of the delegation, who was a Masonic Jew who actually was responsible for the Italian invasion of Libya by secretly pulling 30,000 Ottoman troops from Benghazi ahead of the Italians advancing south. When it was uncovered that he was the one responsible, he fled to Italy to avoid being tried for treason. He handed Abdelhamid the letter of dethronement, and on the 27th of April 1909, Abdelhamid's brother Sultan Mehmed al-Khamis took over the throne. Abdelhamid was sent to live in exile on Salonika, and he was moved back to Constantinople in 1912 after the island finally fell to Greek control. Abdelhamid stayed in Istanbul, living in the Beylerbey Palace until his death in 1918. His janazah was one of the most famous and notable of all the Ottoman sultans, as many of his former enemies from the Young Turks attended, and some even wept at the massive mistake they had made. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Abdelhamid Thani, and subsequently concludes the first season of the Black Banners podcast, Forgotten Heroes. Now, I may add a forgotten hero or two in the future, but for now, we are going to be jumping straight into Season 2, inshallah. I would love to hear you guys' thoughts on Season 1, as well as your thoughts on some of the personalities presented in Season 1. I'd also love to hear your suggestions for personalities that we should present in Season 2. And with that, I will see you all in the second season of the Black Banners podcast. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.